Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian. We are back in Washington, D.C., and we're meeting with Jorge, Domecq, the Chief Executive of the European Defense Agency, who's in town for a whirlwind trip. You're going to be in town for a little over 24 hours to talk to some of your counterparts in the Pentagon. Sir, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Obviously, it's been a very, very busy time for the EDA. I mean, you know, right after the Brexit vote, the global strategy was unveiled by the European Union. Then you have the implementation plan that was approved on November the 14th. And then you have the joint NATO-EU declaration that came out earlier this month on December the 6th. I want to take you to the global strategy first. Tell us a little bit about the global strategy and EDA's role in implementing it.
Well, I think all these documents you have mentioned, which are have the global strategy as the introduction to them, because it's a kind of a defense package, puts us in front of a window of opportunity to get defense in Europe right. And that is something that both our allies here in the US, but also I think our public opinion in Europe are requesting Europe to take defense serious. Not only because we are seeing events to the south and to the east of Europe, but also because if we want to continue to be a relevant partner for the US and a reliable partner, both EU-US relations and a healthy NATO, we need to get our act together and so pull up our socks. So this is what the global strategy underlines. What needs to be done to make European defense more effective. We cannot anymore just continue with the first security strategy, which was put in place by Solana back in 2003. The environmental situation has changed. The European project has changed and moved on after some years. And I think also there are issues like the technological revolution we are living, which puts us in front of the need to really avoid that any in technological gap becomes also a political gap with the US and between Europe and the US.
But about the strategy itself, what are some of the fine points of the strategy? What are some of the things that the EU is looking at as it maps its, you know, sort of the 5-year, 10-year horizon about what are the threats and what are the capabilities that
what the global strategy does is it makes a very clear call for defense cooperation to become the norm. Secondly, it makes a call for developing those capabilities that will allow us to really stand up to the 3 areas of handling crisis, but also protecting European citizens. With the new situation we are seeing going from the terrorist attacks in Europe to the issue of migration, enormous movements of population, which are not any questioning of what NATO stands for, where collective defense continues to be embedded in the NATO Article 5 commitment, but Europe needs to be able to face this new type of threats, which is a threat directly to citizens, and for which perhaps the EU has more tools in its toolbox to solve. So, and the third area where it was clearly stated in the global strategy, we need to do this strengthening cooperation between EU and NATO. And if I may say, there is also a clear call in the global strategy to consider as part of the defense, the European defense industrial and technological base. We cannot have full and reliable capabilities if you do not have a technological and industrial base that sustains it and promotes it.
Europe's is technologically, you know, it spends more than the United States if you add up what all the nations in Europe are spending. And if you look at it, there's an enormous amount of technology that's in Europe. The whole challenge has been getting all the cats herded in one direction. And that's your key role. What's the EDA's role in the strategy and the implementation of the strategy? How are you guys going to take this to the next level in terms of getting countries to cooperate, and countries that have a tendency of not cooperating even when it is manifestly in their interest to do so?
Indeed. You mentioned countries. Well, member states is the key element if this strategy is going to work. What the High Representative and head of the agency done is to put on the table a full menu of possible activities that will put European defense at a different level. And in those recommendations that have been agreed by member states, EDA has 5 main tasks to carry forward. First of all, it has been tasked to develop a new capability development plan with new priorities by 2018. Secondly, we have been asked to look into those aspects of industrial and technological base which we need to preserve and promote in Europe. In other words, to identify the key strategic activities with an added value. It can be skills and competences, it can be industrial capacities, but that we will need to keep in Europe to be able to produce the capabilities that are needed. Third, we have been asked to ensure coherence in European R&D efforts. That means that some R&D activities will continue to be conducted at the national level, but we have to look into what we could do cooperatively in intergovernmental field, which is all the R&D effort we do in the agency. But the third novelty is to ensure that that is coherent also with the R&D that will now be funded by the EU budget coming from the Commission, which is the new sector which has been agreed to in the European Defence Action Plan. Fourth area is to set in place a coordinated annual review, which will imply that we will be trying to bring more transparency to the table in defense planning across Europe, to ensure that the defense plans of the European countries allow us to identify areas of cooperation where that is possible. This coordinated annual review will be set in place, I imagine, probably starting next year, but we will have to define it and define it with member states to see how deep they want to go into this coordinated annual review, which will provide us to do a kind of intergovernmental European defense semester. So your defense plans will be screened with the rest of your partner countries. Fifth, but very important area is the possibility of enhancing what we call the critical enablers. So harmonizing more the requirements of standardization, certification, test and evaluation, multinational training, logistics support. We have many aspects that we are carrying forward in the agency. And if I could add one other aspect which is very important for us if we are to advance in an open and competitive defense market in Europe, is security of supply, which is so important to enhance trust among the different countries when we are looking into consolidating the demand and consolidating also the European defense industrial base.
What are the capabilities? You know, when you look at the capability sets, even though it's something that you're studying, you and I have talked about this over the past several years. What are some of the capability areas that, even though you're still studying it, you know are going to be things that have to be focused on? And then what are some of the technological areas that have to be focus areas from your standpoint?
Clearly we are not starting from scratch, and the global strategy has confirmed, for example, the 4 priority areas identified by heads of state and government in 2013 are relevant and we have to pursue. That means cyber defense, air-to-air refueling, governmental satellite communications, and of course in the area of drones, the remote piloted aircraft, which we have the smaller ones, but we would need to develop a next generation of strategic drones in Europe. Those four areas, we are already with projects and programs going ahead, but we have to end up delivering that. For example, on governmental satellite communications, the agency will be putting to member states several options next year already for decision by the summer. So the other new areas in which we will have to look into will be derived from that revision of the capability development plan that we will have to define by 2018. However, there are areas where we have member states very interested in looking into. For example, anti-tank weapons. There is clearly a need to look into an area which we thought in Europe was long forgone after the end of the Cold War. But now many countries,
because of Russia,
many countries are again looking into this area of anti-tank weapons. So we are now defining the requirements of the future anti-tank weapons, but that means 2030 and onwards, but we are also looking into more short-term solutions as organizing user groups around the different anti-tank weapons that member states are using now or procuring now. So because there are big savings and efficiencies to be gained there, also making our armed forces more interoperable, which is one of the objectives of the agency.
It is part of the other, one of the other big news elements on December the 6th was the agreement between the EU and NATO in terms of the defense relationship. Tell us a little bit about what shape that's going to take. And I do have an equipment follow-up to that. That's sort of what I think is a somewhat logical question to follow after that.
Okay. In Warsaw, at the Warsaw Summit this year, the leaders of EU and NATO decided that they wanted to give a more structured dimension to the relations between EU and NATO, considering the political limitations that have made this relationship less productive than we all wanted it to be. So what the joint declaration signed by the Secretary General of NATO, the President of the European Commission, and the President of the European Council, that was a document which was not owned by member states. So we had to introduce it in the intergovernmental process. That is what has happened now on the 6th of December. At the same time, the North Atlantic Council and the Council at the European level have endorsed a set of 42 specific proposals in 7 areas of cooperation. Those 7 areas of cooperation, there are 6 in which EDA will be doing a key contribution, which are related to capability development, hybrid war, so countering hybrid threats, maritime security, training and exercises, cyber defense. So those are 6 areas out of the 7 where we will have a lot of work in the coming months. And every 6 months, the High Representative on the EU side and the NATO Secretary General on his side will be reporting to respective councils on the work and how that has advanced. So we now have a very clear roadmap that we will have to follow, and this is a process, same as what we have done with the implementation plan is a process. We know where we start, and how far we get, we do not know. That will depend very much on the member states who are going to have the steering wheel of this entire process.
Yes, and they control money, or a large part of the money. One of the questions that always comes up is whether Europe, in an EU capacity, is going to want to reinvent the wheel each time. There's always this notion about competing with the United States or competing against the United States. This time around, will the approach be to look at some things and say, look, we're just going to rely on the United States for this, this, and this. And then here are all of the other places where we are going to place the bets, where we want to make the investment as Europe in order to preserve capabilities. And are there going to be these sorts of trade-offs? Because one of the challenges has been, there's a sense that there's this unnecessary duplication of capabilities capabilities, sometimes on both sides of the Atlantic, that maybe doesn't do anybody any good, and perhaps Europe can take the lead on certain things that perhaps the United States could benefit from.
But what you're saying is all logic. I think no government in Europe wants to duplicate unnecessarily. And as one of the ministers said in a meeting at NATO not long ago, we cannot afford to do it. We would be fighting against ourselves. So what I think is very important is that we see where there is more added value and who does what, exactly as you have said. If we look into hybrid warfare, we might be in an area where the EU is better placed many times to face the challenges we have in Europe. And we should be ready to back perhaps NATO in those aspects. In other cases, as we had in the past, NATO has been able to provide support to operations that the EU is carrying forward. We have seen it, for example, now in Sofia, where this operation, which is there to try and save lives, now has also a function of trying to avoid trafficking, human trafficking, but also armed trafficking. And there NATO has also wanted to support with its maritime means. The important thing is we should not intend to have EU and NATO, which are two completely different organizations with different objectives. We should not build a EU which is NATO-centric, nor have NATO depending on the EU process. It is important that in the end we have a Europe which is able to respond to something that the US has been asking for a long time, is to do the job, if decided, also alone, so that you are a reliable partner. So many times this discussion we have about strategic autonomy, which makes some people shiver, I always say when we talk about strategic autonomy is in reality to be able to have a partner who can act with you when needed. If you have a lame duck, you will not be able to take him along when the crisis gets to a difficult point. So that's why, for example, one important point in the global strategy is calling the Europeans to look for the full spectrum of capabilities, not to limit ourselves to the lower part of the spectrum. I think Europeans have to be ready to do the whole aspect. CSDP, of course, is outside the borders of Europe, but we are seeing that many of the new threats and challenges are transnational, and borders have a secondary importance. Let me just, take two examples. The terrorist attack in Europe, we see the armed forces carrying forward missions which were not initially the main objective of their work, and that will continue to be the case. The capabilities that the military have will be used in civilian activities, or what we call the blurred line between internal and external security will oblige us to look at things less with a black and white perspective. And that's why it's very important that we do not put into question the possibility of the EU carrying forward some tasks related to the protection of its citizens.
You mentioned that the United States has been calling on Europe to spend more money on defense. That's a perennial thing. It's been happening for decades. The president-elect in the United States during the campaign made a lot of statements about Europe, including about NATO, the utility of the organization. He has since said that, spoke to Jens Stoltenberg and said that, there's an acknowledgement about the importance of the Atlantic Alliance. But, from a European perspective, and also from a NATO perspective, defense spending has been rising. Do you think that the change in government in the United States is going to spur nations to do more on their own is there a sense, as some have even here, which you've heard from some prominent Republican politicians, members of Congress, John McCain has discussed this, Lindsey Graham has sort of discussed his concerns that maybe the United States might not be there for its allies. Is there a sense that the United States will be there for Europe? And does the change of government in the United States going to spur Europe to increase spending and to accelerate efforts to take defense more seriously, perhaps?
If I have to now try and guess what the new government in the US will do in the defense realm, I think that one area where there will be a continuity of that message is precisely asking Europeans to take more responsibility for their own security. I think that President Trump and his new administration will be passing on this message as clearly as the previous administrations have done. Now, the way in which the US will continue to be engaged in Europe might be subject to changes. I am not able to tell you at this point in time, but I do think that any US administration will continue to give the importance that NATO has now and will have in the future. So that is my expectation. If I were to ask myself, one thing is, I imagine that the new administration will also want the EU as a project to have success and to remain strong and united. And that is why I believe in the end that the European defense moving ahead now in the EU context will be something that will be welcomed by President Trump and the new administration.
That said, the lead Brexit, the UKIP boss, Farage, was in the United States, campaigned with Mr. Trump, and at the end of when Trump won, Trump suggested that he should become the ambassador to the Farage should become the UK's ambassador to the United States. UK is on a path to leave the EU. At least that's the stated policy, although it remains to be seen how that's going to happen and the mechanics of it. There's questions now about whether Parliament can vote and intercede about leaving the EU or not, although the May government has made it clear that their intention is to carry out the people's will in terms of the referendum. How does the departure of the UK from the EU affect the EDA and affect the entire European defense project, given that the UK has among the most sophisticated industries, is one of the largest EU nations, and certainly one of the two most martial, most military nations, most active nations, which is France and the UK.
Provided once the UK will invoke Article 50 to start negotiations to leave the EU, within that context, the UK will also have to decide at that point what it will imply for its relationship with EDA. Now, having said that, what I have been able to presence in more than once in the Council, in the EU, is that UK has declared clearly that they want to continue to be involved in European defense. And more precisely, with EDA, they will want to remain near. So I might see a situation in which the only way in which we can ensure continuity of the good work that the UK has been doing in the agency in all these years is through an administrative arrangement, which would have to negotiate it the day they want to leave from the agency. There is, I think, also, if you allow me, a clear indication that even the UK recognizes that EDA will play an important role in European defense and in the construction of the European defense in the coming years, because this year, after 6 years of frozen budget, it has been decided that an increase, although not all what had been requested, has been agreed by member states. So that's a very important political signal.
And so you can see there being a relationship with the UK being part of the EDA or a participant in the EDA, even though the UK may not be a member nation of the EU.
Exactly, through an administrative arrangement, as we have now with other NATO allies like Norway, which are not part of the EU, but they participate in many projects and programs and activities in the agency.
You have been spending a lot in these sort of quick hit sort of ways, but you're a frequent visitor to Washington in order to maintain and improve relations with the Pentagon. Should there be some form of administrative participation by the United States in the EDA in some capacity, aside from just your efforts to sort of marshal and to make sure that everybody's on the same side? I know you've been extremely interested in the third offset strategy. You've been very interested in and really on top of the innovation agenda as well, in terms of sort of pushing it in Europe, and I want to get your sense on both of those as well. But do you think that there should be somewhat more formal a role, whether in an observer status or a delegate or somebody who can participate in those discussions, so that there's a transatlantic dialogue and link there as well?
I think it would be a logic corollarium of the reinforcement of the EU-NATO relationship, which has now been structured through the joint declaration. What can be part of that cooperation remains to be defined, but there is a clear interest both from a point of view of interoperability between our armed forces, but also because of the presence of of US forces in Europe, there are many of the EU wider policies which have an impact on the US forces in the European theater, which can benefit of a lot of the work that we do in EDA. So those would be two areas which I think would merit attention as we path perhaps a more structured cooperation with the US.
What are the implications if the United States is less supportive of a strong EU and a strong NATO? What are the implications if the United States were to just start distancing itself from its European allies?
As I said before, I do not foresee that in the cards. I clearly think that one thing is that the US will want a more effective European defense, so that member states cooperate more in Europe to rely less on the US capabilities. For example, that there you have the big effort we have been doing in the air-to-air refueling field, where the Libyan crisis brought out the enormous gap that existed in the European capacity. We can't continue to have a technological but also a capability gap that the US has to fill up each time we have a major crisis in our surroundings. So I think the US will support a stronger European defense. I think it will remain engaged because many of the main problems that are flaring around Europe are not something which stop in Europe. It will affect us. What we are seeing now is that the new security threats and challenges affect us globally. They cannot be limited. So for example, if we look into big migration movements, that in the end will also have an impact in the US, and vice versa. The ones in the US will have an impact in Europe. The same goes for terrorism. Terrorism is no longer something that you say, well, okay, what is happening there will not affect us back here in the US, or vice versa. It is intimately connected, as unfortunately we have seen for the last 15 or 16 years. So I think we both understand that we share the same values, and that has been recognized in the joint declaration EU-NATO. We share a same security environment. And in the joint declaration, in the conclusions of the Council, it says our security is interconnected. So I would not foresee the government which is signing up to those statements is thinking about disengaging.
Will the threat situation that exists now, right? I mean, the terrorism issue, the migrant issue, Russia, they're increasing. European friends of mine, we talk about the importance of considering China and what a European role would be given, how important the region is economically. But also a lot of the European countries are out, have trading relationships with China, but are also allies with some of the countries that China is bullying. And I want to get your sense on that in a minute. But do you think that the nature of the challenges this time are going to be enough to foster the kind of cooperation that we sometimes haven't seen as nations have put their own national, for example, industrial interest ahead of the collective interest of the EU and collective security and collective economy? I mean, sometimes, nations have pressed ahead with national programs, for example, that may not have been necessarily in the advantage of all the EU states.
I think we have, as I said before, a window opportunity, and that affects in a very decisive way what we do industrially in Europe in the coming years. And here I think this will mean, first of all, that we cannot continue to have a fragmented demand in Europe. We cannot have 154 main weapon systems in Europe, types of weapon systems, while you have 27 in the US. That is killing for any industrial base. How we do it? Well, through defense cooperation. Defense cooperation has one rule: it has to be voluntary. We cannot impose that. Now, there's a very important opportunity we have now with the European Defence Action Plan, where the Commission is putting on the table resources, regulatory powers to support and incentivize that member states do things together. So that, for example, the supply chains of industry are open to SMEs across borders, that defense research, which is done among countries and with industries from different countries in working in consortiums, that will be supported by EU budget. In the agency, we have already started this year a small program which is 1.5 million euros, which 3 activities, which has demonstrated the catalytic effect of EU budget. We received 21 proposals, the call for proposals, coming from 20 member states and getting together primes, small and medium enterprises, research centers, academia, from 83 different entities, which shows you when there is an interest to get priorities that have a possibility of becoming capabilities after, so there will be programs. It's not just research for the sake of research. That is going to work. Next year, we are going one step further with the preparatory action, which foresees a budget in principle of 25 million euros every year devoted to several projects with demonstrators included. And if that works well and it is a success story, the idea is in the next multi-annual financial framework of the EU, so this the multi-annual budget 2021-2027, the projection that the Commission is suggesting is that there are 500 million euros a year devoted to defense research, not dual, but defense research, which will transform the EU into the 4th investor in defense research on the continent. That is a very important challenge that we have to ensure is devoted to areas of technological research which do have an EU added value. That means that probably because of complex systems or because they are very sensitive, one member state cannot do it, but we can do it cooperatively with a group.
And how much money is your annual budget going to be, roughly?
My annual budget, the operational budget and what we call the general budget is now, it was 31 million for next year. But you should not see that in isolation, because, for example, this year, where we are negotiating 26 ad hoc projects, where we have a number of member states in each one of them, sums up 120 million. So since the beginning of the agency, we have done more than 1 billion in research activities, which is an important contribution to European defense.
I know your time is short, so I have two questions to ask you. First is an Asia question. Does the EDA and the EU need to think much more in terms of, when you say global strategy, one of the flashpoints is the South China Sea. It is in Asia. There are concerns about China's rise. Again, a very important economic partner for the United States, which is what makes the relationship kind of very complicated. But does Europe need to start thinking about China, what's happening in that part of the world as it builds its defense plans? That the capabilities Europe builds may need to be longer range, more sustainable at distance, for example, than they are in a continental context that historically has been the view.
The global strategy looks at the different partnerships throughout the world, and Asia is clearly one area of interest for Europe, especially not only as a commercial partner, but also because of the wider interest in the region. So the protection, for example, of the sea lines of communication is an issue, and that is reflected in the security and defense aspect of the global strategy. So it will have a reflection also on the maritime capabilities we will be looking into, to just give you an example.
And let me ask you, you and I have talked a lot about the innovation initiative and the third offset strategy. And from the very beginning, you were saying this isn't an American thing, this is really a transatlantic thing, whether in a NATO context, but also particularly from the EU context. There's a question about whether or not the incoming administration is going to embrace these agendas. But from your standpoint, as somebody who's focused so much time in sort of understanding it and applying it, how fertile is the ground? I mean, do your member nations understand the third offset strategy? Because even there are some people here who don't know. One of our mutual friends in the Pentagon said that, hey, the good news is Jorge gets it, even though there might be some people in Washington who might not get it. Is there fertile ground? Is that something that is going to be a key element, including an innovation agenda that you're transplanting and want to flourish in Europe? And how are you doing that to make sure that you're building those sorts of commercial military links that have been so important, for example, to Dr. Carter and Bob Work and others in the department?
I think there is no defense ministry in Europe or in the US which can escape the challenge of trying to embrace innovation and bring it nearer to defense. And why is innovation resisting that? It is resisting it because its business model, the business model of the innovation industries, is not compatible with the way in which we run, initiate, and deliver in the capability programs of the traditional defense industry. It is a new industry which is providing technologies that we will need in the defense field. And that is why, if you look at all the major member states, they all have some sort of innovative strategy or innovative initiative which they have launched to try and attract these innovative industries. And that will not go away, even if there's a change of administration. The need to rely on artificial intelligence, to look into big data, to look into 3D printing, just to choose three, will continue to be there. How we ensure that that industry will get near the defense sector is another thing, and it has to be solved on a case-by-case basis. What we are doing in the EDA is to try and ensure also that EDA becomes a hub to attract these innovative industries. in the way not only of selecting what technologies we have to look into, but also making sure that the development process takes into account the characteristics of this industry, which sometimes does not want to be harnessed in the same way as the older horses of the classical defense industry.
And do you think in terms of a third offset strategy, where you may have to make some much more clever trade-offs and long-term thinking, do you think that that's something that's going to be sort of a key feature in the thinking going forward?
I think it's going to be key. The industry that supports defense capability development is going to change radically in the next 10, 15 years. It will have nothing to do with what we know now. It will be more about systems and ways in which you handle them more than platforms. We should start thinking in those terms.
And one very last question. What happens, do you think that there's a danger that Britain will go entirely in its own direction when it comes to defense and decide that it does not want to do cooperative programs, or do you think that that's not a realistic expectation?
It's not the science I am getting so far. Just to take one example, they have the bilateral treaty with France, the Lancaster Treaty, with very important programs which are already producing results now, and I don't see UK breaking up its commitments in that context, and that is only one example.
You know, what are you trying to achieve here on this visit? I know that you're meeting with Keith Webster, who is the international chief in the office, in Frank Kettle's office. I'm Under Secretary of Technology, Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. What are some of the things you're trying to achieve on this visit?
Well, what I would very much like is, in the new context of the Joint Declaration EU-NATO, to see what are the expectations of the US administration towards EDA. What would they expect that could deliver in the future in a more structured way?
Jorge, thank you very, very much.